So, Hessische Bergstraße is probably the least known of Germany's 13 wine regions. I have been tasting German wines since I went out of kindergarten. To tell you what Keuper is, think about limestone. Limestone is a powdery, compressed white stone made of the remnants of sea creatures from millions of years ago. Yes? Do we have an agreement about this amateur definition of limestone? And yeah, I know minerality doesn't exist and the vine absorbs nothing from the soil and blah blah blah. We have all heard the story. But I always find wines from metamorphic soils and granite especially to have that really special kind of acidity to them. You know? And wonderful that they can also send wines like this to Poland, because I think this is a kind of Pinot that is going to resonate with our public very well. Because it is also building a bridge, for example, with our Pinot Noirs, which are often on the light side, and you know, this sort of crunchy, vibrant character that reminds me of Kamil Barczentewicz. Why not? Yeah? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience again. And we have an exciting session of 6 cool climate Pinot Noirs that I will try to concentrate in 50 minutes, I think, because we have another session later. So welcome again, Cool Climate Summit. It's not exactly cool climate today in Warsaw, which is a good illustration of some of the topics that we are going to touch, because some of the wines that we have are coming from regions that are moving from cool climates to something a little bit more dialectic. But I think we have a nice list of 6 wines. You now have the printed lists, okay, so we are going in order. Even if the order is a little controversial, but we will discuss this later. The first wine that we have today is an actual cool climate Pinot Noir, because it is coming from the Czech Republic, or as we should now be saying, Czechia. Some people in Czechia, they hate the word Czechia. So Lenka Sedlačková, my fellow master of wine, she told me not to use the term Czechia. So the Czech Republic, but this is a very unusual wine, I think, for most of you, unless you have big experience in tasting wines from this country, because 85% of the production of the Czech Republic is coming from the Moravia region in the south, bordering with Austria, and these are the wines that we are sort of familiar with, at least here in Poland. But the wine that we have now is coming from the north of the country, which has a very small wine production. These 2 wine regions together are less than 700 hectares of vineyards planted. They are divided into 2 districts, Litoměřice po polsku i Mielnik, Melnicka and Litoměřicka. And they are very small scale production located in a pretty cool climate. I would say that this is a pretty cool climate for Pinot Noir. And it is very interesting to see a Pinot grown there, because these regions traditionally have mostly made white wine because of the climate, but they have a long-standing tradition of making red wine that is going back to the Emperor Charles IV. And I think we have a rare opportunity to taste the wine from that place. Now, on the photo here, we have the current owners of Winne Sklepy Kutna Hora, which is a relatively young wine estate that was established 2 decades ago, but on former provincial grounds of the Schwarzenberg family, which, as you know, is one of the most important noble families in the history of Czechia and also the Austrian Empire. With many distinguished members of the family serving the imperial, the Habsburg dynasty. And so Karl Schwarzenberg was given back some of the very extensive domains of this family historically that were confiscated after World War II. And on the site of some historical vineyards, this new wine estate, Kutna Hora, was established, which is now run by the father and son team of the Rudolskis. So Karl Schwarzenberg is the co-owner, but the history of this land is absolutely belonging to the Schwarzenberg family and dynasty. And we have the top of the range from this estate, the Pinot Noir, which is called Staré keře, which means the same as alte Reben, so old vines. In this case, it's a relative term because the vines were planted in the 1970s. But if you know your Czech and Moravian wines a little bit, this is not a country that has an extensive amount of old vines. Everything was replanted in socialist times for the sake of larger volume production and collectivization. So to actually found 50-year-old Pinot plantings is a rarity in the Czech Republic, and here we have an opportunity to have a Pinot Noir from mature vines, as opposed to most of Moravian Pinot Noir, which is a growing production and interesting production, but most of these vineyards have been planted after 1991. So I don't have data on the aging of this wine because the producer is keeping it secret and they are not even here. They are represented by the National Czech Wine Agency. But I think we can deduct from the profile of this wine that it was made and aged like Burgundy. I think there is some oak aging and some new oak also in the blend. The soils are mostly limestones, but they are sort of eroded limestone mixed with a lot of rivers, sands, river marls. So relatively fertile kind of limestone that is quite different from Burgundy, which is a much older kind of limestone. But generally speaking, we think this is one of the best soil types for Pinot Noir. Even though today on the tasting we're going to have some really interesting soil variations on Pinot. We're going to have Pinot from granite and Pinot from slate. So we're going to discuss this a little bit later. So as you see, the winery was founded 24 years ago. But as I said, since imperial times in the 1200s, Charles IV, Pinot Noir was brought to this area by Cistercian monks from Burgundy. Remember that both Burgundy and Czechia used to belong to the Holy German Empire. Okay, it was part of not maybe one country, but sort of one culture. So this was the direction of importing all the Burgundy varieties, also Pinot Gris, to the what we call today the imperial lands. So Czechia, Moravia, Austria as well is having plantings of Burgundy varieties dating from that period. It's a rare opportunity to taste any of these wines because they are not exported at all. They are distributed locally and mostly in Prague and on the local market in northern Czechia. So we relatively rarely have the opportunity to taste them. I think this is a Pinot Noir with a high acid, quite a crunchy structure. You can sense the tannic extraction has been rather high. I would say like traditional Burgundy extraction, quite sort of prominent tannins with a bit of oak. But you can still feel the noblesse of the Pinot Noir, which if we are in the world of Czech and Moravian red wines, they're often fairly rustic. Because the alternative red grape varieties to make the wines from include Zweigelt, Frankowka, so Blaufränkisch. So you rarely have, also Bordeaux varieties, but they rarely get very ripe. So you rarely have really polished tannins in Czech red wines. I think this is one of the challenges for this country is to make red wines with a more refined tannic profile. But surely this wine is getting there, and it is showing an alternative style to the Moravian Pinot Noirs. Moravia is not really a cool climate, honestly. It has a cooling influence from the weather when the weather is coming from the north, when it's coming from Poland via what is called the Moravian Gate. So there is like a lowering of the terrain in the Sudeten mountains, and sometimes they get a cool air circulation from the north, but very often they are subject to continental climate coming from Austria, and it's actually quite I would say moderate to warm climate. Maybe not warm, but I would say moderate climate. Fully ripening grape varieties such as Riesling or Welsh Riesling, which are very late ripening grape varieties. But in Czechia, this is definitely a much more cool situation, much less influenced by the continental climate from the east and south. And so I think we have this Pinot Noir with some real pith. Yeah, this is, I think, a Burgundian style like Burgundy was making them 20 years ago, on the edge of ripeness, sometimes needing maybe some chaptalization to get a slightly higher alcohol percentage. I think this is 13%, but the good people who have the bottles, it's 13.5 on the label, but I think it's 13.1 or something from the tech sheet. If you have any comments, I invite you to speak live right now, not at the end, because we will forget the first wine once we get to number 6. So if there is any question or comment, please feel free.
Is it the only biodynamic winery in Czechia?
This is the info on their website. It might be the only certified. I don't think there is another Demeter, I mean, not to my knowledge, Demeter winery in Czechia, but I might be wrong. I'm quoting the material from the website. Okay, let's move to number 2. You guys have number 2. I found this interesting wine map from 1901 of the Nahe wine region. Oh, sorry, because the second wine is Hessische Bergstraße, so sorry, not in order. Yeah, here we go. So, Hessische Bergstraße is probably the least known of Germany's 13 wine regions. I have been tasting German wines since I went out of kindergarten in 1997, but I must say I don't have a lot of experience with Hessische Bergstraße because it is a very, very small wine region. It is at the moment 600 hectares in total, most of them very small family estates that only sell locally. There are only maybe 3 or 4 wineries that you ever see at sort of wine events. I think 3 members of the VDP historically. So this is a map of like the central German wine districts. And so you can see for reference Mainz and Wiesbaden. So this is where the Rheingau is starting. Rheinhessen is south of Mainz. And we are on the opposite side of the Rhine. In a very interesting, geographically interesting part of Germany. Because the particularity of this district is that almost all of the vineyards there are facing west, which is a relatively rare occurrence in Germany. Normally vineyards, especially on the main rivers such as the Rhine, the Mosel, also the Main, were planted looking for a south exposure to maximize the ripeness, which was of course hard to achieve, especially for late ripening grape varieties such as the noble Riesling. As you know, Riesling is the last grape to be picked in Germany, often into November. And so everything was done to like bring more ripeness into the grapes, especially after the little ice age of the 1700s and early 1800s, where the climate became cooler. And most of what we know today as the German wine culture was really developed into the form that we have today, okay? But the Hessische Bergstraße is actually a slightly different place because of the terrain. They are mostly facing west. You can't see much on this slide, but it is a very picturesque place of Germany with some really high hills. But otherwise, what is really interesting in this place is that it is really, really steep. So sometimes we think that the steepest vineyards in Germany are somewhere in the Saar. You know, if you go with Roman Niewodniczański, we always tell you that he's got the steepest vineyards in the world, and everybody is quoting him since 25 years. I think some of these vineyards are actually a little bit more vertical than that. And yeah, it's interesting because this place is actually quite warm. I was just speaking to the producer who is here with Schloss Schönberg, and he was mentioning that actually they get more ripeness in the Pinot Noir than most places in Baden, and the Pinot Noir from the Hessische Bergstraße has this slightly more opulent, slightly sort of almost Mediterranean character, even compared to what we think is the warmest place to grow Spätburgunder in Germany, which is the Baden. So this is a really relatively up-and-coming estate that has been making a name for itself only in the last, I would say, maybe 10 years. With some white wines, but especially Pinot Noir, and they have 3. You can later go and visit them on the table. They have 2 wines that we would define as sort of village wines. And 1 single vineyard. So we have one of the village wines now, and it is named from the type of soil, which is called Ranke. And Ranke is a sort of mica-rich granite, okay? It is black, it is reverberating a lot of sunshine, so even further maximizing, like, you know, sun exposure, photosynthesis, and ripeness. And this wine, it was made from Burgundy clones that the estate has planted some 30 years ago. So they were actually quite pioneers in adopting French clones in Germany before it was cool. Now almost every Pinot winemaker in Germany is going to have a mixture of German clones and French clones. And German clones are also like old clones, high yield clones, and also some newer, developed, smaller yield, high quality clones. But the Burgundy clones, of course, are always giving the wine a special sheen, a special sort of texture. I don't want to say finesse because that would be, a little bit maybe too judgmental versus German clones, but certainly there is something in the fruit profile that is often a little bit darker, a little bit earthier in French clones, Spätburgunders compared to German clones. So this one is seeing a lot of new oak, but what I think is really interesting is how it has been able to absorb this oak, and of course you sort of feel the oak, but like also I think in a good Burgundy, oak is sort of a part of the conversation. It is an instrument in the orchestra, but it's not a prima donna, okay? I think this is stemming from the concentration of this wine. The substance here is very concentrated, and of course one requisite that you need to have for good oak absorption, something that I think many people overlook, is to have really ripe grapes, okay? If you have like slightly underripe grapes, slightly more green leafy characters, which is absolutely fine to make a Pinot more on the vegetal side, I don't mind. They tend to be quite drinkable and refreshing. But the last thing that you want to do with this is put it into a new oak with toast and sweet vanilla, because you're going to have a clash of personalities. So when you have really ripe grapes like they have in the Hessische Bergstraße due to this exposure and special soil, then I think the wine works pretty well with oak. The alcohol, I wrote in the description that it's like a balanced alcohol, but I think it's actually some of the sort of higher alcohol situations in German Spätburgunder. Maybe apart from them sort of southern Baden, maybe some Pfalz producers who are getting above 14%, but otherwise this is quite a full-bodied, I would say, take on Pinot. But look at the acidity. The acidity has got that sort of special crunch and special energy to it. And I know minerality doesn't exist, and the vine absorbs nothing from the soil, and blah blah blah. We have all heard the story. But I always find wines from metamorphic soils and granite especially to have that really special kind of acidity to them, If you have Syrah from the Northern Rhone, which is sort of a similar, maybe not quite the same type of granite, because the Rhone is more on a sort of brown, slightly more eroded granite than this like really hard black. But you get this sort of really crunchy, bitter cherry juiciness, acidity in the Syrahs from the Northern Rhone, and I find a similarity here. So remember, Burgundy people, they used to like Syrah very much and used as much Syrah in their own wines as they could, especially in poorer vintages, to boost the fruitiness. But also there is quite an overlap in the character of Pinot Noir and Syrah in some situations, and I think this is obviously a Spätburgunder. It's a very classic Pinot, but there is something in the acidity, in the liveliness, in the energy of this wine that I find a little bit more similar to Syrah. Are you enjoying this wine? I think it's a great discovery from a wine region that I would have to force you to go and taste Hessische Bergstraße if you are at Provine or Weinbörse, because it is usually the last region that you are going to think about. Okay, the next one is from the Nahe. So, okay, this was the slide about the Nahe. So when I was researching today's masterclass, I came across this map that I thought was really interesting and nice, because it is showing you a couple of really interesting things that were happening 125 years ago in the Nahe. So of course the geography hasn't changed. It is still in the same place in Germany. So, okay, where the Rhine is turning after flowing for 60 kilometers from east to west, which is quite unique because it's a river that flows usually from south to north, but because it is facing the Taunus mountains, it has to turn. And this is why on the northern bank of the Rhine we have the Rheingau vineyards that have this lovely south exposure, and then the tributary of the Rhine, which is the Nahe river, is flowing through here. Bad Kreuznach is here, Bingen, where it enters the Rhine. And what is interesting on this map is that we see that the highest concentration of vineyards was located here at the north, at the sort of more Rhine section already then of the region, but also they already had a classification of vineyards into three classes in 1901. So they were already having a structure that the VDP has now established in the vineyards of Germany into the Große Lage and Erste Lage that was already existing, and we know that the VDP has been actively researching those historical classification either in the Nahe but also in other regions such as the Pfalz. And we see that also in the sort of upper place there were also some classified vineyards, some vineyards in darker color that were classified as being very good for the vine. Now, in the Nahe, the Spätburgunder is really an afterthought because it is 1.4% of the plantings, if I am not mistaken. And it is a wine region that we absolutely associate with white wines, especially Riesling, but also some nice Burgundy varieties. And Pinot Noir, even though it is widely grown in the Rheingau, which is the neighbor of the Nahe to the north, and it is grown also in the Rheinhessen, which is the neighbor of the Nahe to the east, it has never really been very much in focus. But the Zins family have always been championing Pinot Noir. Rudolf Zins was actually one of the pioneers of this grape in the region, and now we have a wine from the Rosenberg single vineyard that you can see here on the picture. So it is the thing located where the houses are. So you see that it's not a very steep vineyard, but there's still a nice sun exposure, and the Nahe River, which is not a very big river, but it is giving the region this name. So they make 3 Pinots from this single vineyard, but we are now tasting the top of the range, which is the actually labeled with the single vineyard, the Rosenberg Spätburgunder. R is of course short for reserve. They are not using this term anymore on the labels, but we have the R, and it is a wine that is made like a Burgundy, also maybe in the older times with a slightly longer aging, nearly 2 years in oak here, 1/3 of it which is new, is all French oak. And the soil in this vineyard is a combination of sand, which is a sand from eroded limestone as the topsoil, on a limestone base. So as you know, the Nahe is the geologically most diverse wine region in Germany. They have everything going from schist and slate up to, clay. But in this particular case, there is limestone, and this is also why the Zins family have decided to focus on Pinot Noir. Because of course you can have very, very good Riesling from limestone. Our friends in Alsace know something about it. But Germans, they don't so much value Riesling coming from the limestone soils. They prefer to have volcanic metamorphic soils as the terroir of election for growing Riesling, and whenever there is limestone, they will be opting for Burgundy varieties. Either Pinot Noir, but we also have some very, very handsome Pinot Blanc and Chardonnay from the limestone, including in the Nahe. Some of my favorite Pinot Blancs are coming from the Pfalz and the Nahe, and they come usually from the limestone. There isn't much stylistic reference in terms of Nahe Pinot Noir. As we know, the producers from this region, also when they make white wines, they prefer to have rather fine, filigree, acid-driven vertical wines. It is not a region of opulent wines at all. They are sometimes even considered to be very sharp, with very good aging potential. When I travel to Wiesbaden every year for the VDP Großes Gewächs avant-première, I must tell you that the flight of the Nahe wines that is coming, to kill you at some point in the day, because we taste 150 wines per day if we want to taste everything. I never look forward to tasting young wines from the Nahe. They are always very, very challenging to taste when they are young, 1 year old. You can have a lot of sort of hedonistic fun tasting Pfalz Riesling shortly after they are bottled, but Nahe is usually quite difficult. So there is something of that aura, there is something of that austerity, also I think in this Pinot Noir. This is a wine that is reminding me of some of the northern Burgundy approaches to Pinot Noir, maybe Marsanais, and even I was thinking when I tasted their simpler wine, the Village wine, that I invite you to taste at the producer's table, I was thinking of Irancy, so the Pinot Noir from Chablis, which is like a really, really sharp Pinot, okay? If you are looking for acidity in your Pinot, this is the way to go, apart, of course, from Poland, yes? Apart from Wrocław, Lower Silesia, go and taste an Irancy. Also an interesting comparison that we are not able to do here, but if you go and taste with Markus Zinz, who is at the table, the brother of the current winemaker Johannes. Oh yes, the family was here. Did I show you the family? Yes, they are here. So Markus is the guy with the bird, and he's pouring the wines for you today and tomorrow at the Cool Climate Summit. So if you go and taste with him at the table, he's got 3 wines from 3 different clonal situations from the same vineyard. So it is also a very good educational thing to do, because you can taste a wine that is 100% older German clones with a slightly higher production. You can have 100% newly developed, improved German clones with that sort of slightly more spicy, also like round character, I think. And then this wine is made with a mixture of those new German clones, but mostly Burgundy clones. So I think, you know, it is completely legitimate to be speaking about the Burgundian style of Spätburgunder. Maybe the German producers, sometimes they don't really like it, but yeah, whether you like it or not, it's still the reference region for Pinot Noir. And the cross inspiration between Burgundy and German wine regions is very, very important. Okay, it's very near. If you want to drive from the Nahe to Burgundy, don't speed in France. Okay, good advice. The police is very active there, but it will take you like maybe 3.5 to 4 hours. So I think you can go for the weekend. If you make wine in Germany, you go for the weekend to drink some Burgundy. Maybe the other way around. Now the young winemakers from France, they are interested in what Germany is doing as well. So I think this is a slightly more supple wine compared to the Hessische Bergstraße, but there is that kind of, you know, verticality that we often find in Nahe. Okay, do you have the wine number 3 and 4? You have the wine number 4. I don't have the wine number 4, so I need the wine number 4, please. No, I've heard no. This was 2. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so the next wine is coming from a region that I love very deeply, which is the Franconia. So Franken, the funny thing is that, funny fact, if you do any wine education, Franken is part of the federal land of Bavaria, even though when you read books they will always tell you that Bavaria doesn't make wine, they drink beer. But actually, yes, Bavaria makes wine, administratively speaking, because the historical region of Franconia is today within Bavaria. Franconia has a very, very old tradition going back to the sort of Middle Ages, the 1100s and the 1200s, because it is one of the few former parts of Germany before the unification that was run by the church. They never had a prince, but it was always run by the bishop, and the bishop of Würzburg was one of the electors of the German Empire. Okay, so he had a vote on who would become the emperor, but he was one of the church, one of the, actually three bishops who were allowed to the imperial diet. And Würzburg is, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful places in Germany. It was just a little bit bombed by our American friends in 1945. But most of it is still beautifully preserved, Baroque city, lavish. It reminds me a little bit of Vienna, yes, with its wonderful Baroque churches and architecture. And here you have a physical map of the Franconia. So you can see, if you go, this is the river here is the Main River, so it is not the Rhine, this is the Main. And if you go downstream, so upper left from the screen, you will arrive to Frankfurt, okay? You will arrive, to Mainz and Wiesbaden. So Frankfurt is going to be further to the north, and Mainz and Wiesbaden. So the last section of the Main before Wiesbaden and Mainz actually belongs already to the Rheingau, but this part has its own separate wine region, which is Franconia. And we usually speak about 2 sub-regions, which is the triangle and the square, okay? Viereck and Dreieck. But what is really interesting about this is that they have 3 types of soils. And this is the Wirsching family, which is one of the oldest winemaking family in Franconia. I think Hans is the 14th generation, and they started making wine in the 1600s. Okay, and a snapshot of the vineyards in Iphofen, which is the village where they are located. And the wine that we are tasting is actually a village, Spätburgunder, so it's an Ortswein. It is the middle of the VDP wine pyramid. As you can see, the slopes here are much less dramatic than those in the wine regions located on the Rhine. The type of cultivation is a little bit different. Unless you are strictly in Würzburg with very steep vineyards, for example, the famous historical Würzburger Stein. So, the soil here is called Keuper. Now, Keuper is very difficult to translate. In Polish we say Keuper, but it doesn't really explain much. So, to tell you what Keuper is, think about limestone. Limestone is a powdery, compressed white stone made of the remnants of sea creatures from millions of years ago. Yes? Do we have an agreement about this amateur definition of limestone? Now, Keuper is the same thing, but millions, hundreds of millions of years older, and not sea sediments, but actually, you know, from ground sediments. Okay, so animals and plants that decomposed and left a powdery brown, grayish brown substrate material that gradually compressed into a stone. So it is actually quite similar to limestone in terms of water retention. Okay, it retains water. It is rather a cool kind of stone, but the composition is very different because it is low in calcium carbonate, unlike limestone. So it is giving wines, whites and reds, a special kind of spice. Now, Franconia is mostly specializing in white wines, and it is the last island that has extensive plantings of the Silvaner grape variety. Silvaner is one of the oldest grape varieties grown in Germany, predating Riesling surely by several hundred years. We know it from the genealogical trees of these grapes, probably as old as Pinot, if not older. Okay, Silvaner. And it used to be the dominant grape variety in German vineyards at the beginning of the 20th century. We are very excited when we read about the very expensive German wines, Schwarzenberg and other Mosel wines from the Riesling. But a little bit like today, they were the elite, that was the top of the iceberg. But most of Germany was planted with other grapes than Riesling, and Silvaner was a very important grape. Then it was supplanted by in more industrial grapes such as Müller-Thurgau for mass market production, especially of sweeter wines. And so only now in the Franken we have a lot of Silvaner, and I encourage you to taste Wirsching's Silvaners because they are some of the best. And I think Silvaner is a wonderful grape that we should drink more often. Poland should plant a lot of Silvaner. Don't stupidly plant Pinot and Riesling everywhere, because most of the places where we plant Riesling and Pinot are not very good for those grapes. But we could have a very, very good Silvaner. Of course, it's not very sexy to sell. Now, there are pockets of Spätburgunder cultivation in Franconia, especially on those heavier Keuper soils and also partly on limestone. And this wine has not been in oak, so it is a little bit different from the wines that preceded it, but I wanted to go region by region into a region that is a little bit warmer, surely, than the Nahe Franken. And I think we have a very pretty rendition of what is certainly now a big trend in Germany, is to have a lighter style of Pinot Noir. Much more drinkable, a wine that you can chill, also drink in the summer, drink with lighter foods, because this is what the market wants. And especially, I mean, not only in Poland, also in Germany, young people are requiring, lighter wines, often without oak, just to have the pure expression of the grape variety. And this is what you are getting here. At the same time, with some seriousness and the real character of the grape variety, but also like a terroir expression that I think is nicely shown here. The acidity is fresh, I wouldn't say that it is driving the wine. The tannins are present, but I wouldn't say they are, driving the wine. What is driving the wine is this crunchy, fresh, fruity character of Pinot. So I think a good idea from Germany to make this style of Pinot, because if these wines are often chosen as alternatives to Burgundy, this is a kind of Pinot that you very rarely get in Burgundy. Okay, you very rarely get an unoaked Pinot Noir from Burgundy, and especially so light and fresh. Also because of the prices, I think the Burgundy winemakers are feeling ambitious about how they make the Pinot, but the Germans, especially for the local market, they can present this style, and wonderful that they can also send wines like this to Poland, because I think this is a kind of Pinot that is going to resonate with our public very well, because it is also building a bridge, for example, with our Pinot Noirs, which are often on the light side, and this sort of crunchy, vibrant character that reminds me of Kamil Barczentewicz. Why not? Yeah. Okay. No comments. Please go and taste the Silvaner. Okay. I want you to go home after tasting the Silvaner today. You will have done something for this grape variety. We should do everything to preserve it, because it has really been with us for 1500 years, and would be a pity if it went completely missing. Okay, the last two wines that we have are coming from the same wine region in Germany, which is called the Ahr. The Ahr is a little river that flows into the Mosel between Koblenz and into the Rhine, between Koblenz and Bonn, as you see. So it is a little brother to the Mosel, which also flows into the Rhine between Koblenz, at Koblenz. Of course, much smaller, and the Ahr is also sharing one important characteristic with the Mosel, which is the dominating kind of soil, which is slate. And a particular kind of slate that is prominent in the Ahr, which is the blue slate, what is called in German Devonschiefer, coming from the Devon sub-period, is also to be found in the Mosel. Also, as you know, the Mosel has many different types of slate, green, white, red, black, and so on. And the Ahr is a funny place, because as you can see, it is one of the most northernmost regions of Germany, even further north than the Mosel, which is considered the cool sort of wine region of Germany. But Ahr has been specializing in red wines for a long time, and although it has a little bit of Riesling as well, it mostly has Spätburgunder, and it is the largest, it's a small region, it's got 700 hectares, I think, or 800 hectares by the current standing, but it is the largest pocket of Pinot Noir in the world on volcanic soils, because normally we don't grow Pinot Noir on volcanic soils, but here, yes indeed. So you see there are 7 VDP wineries in the Ahr. We're going to taste wine from one of them, but we are going to start with a non-VDP member, which is this really interesting winery. Here is the winemaker, Alexander Weber. This is the vineyard that the wine is coming from. So very steep slopes, but very often terraced viticulture. As you know, in the Mosel, there are parts of vineyards that are on terraces, but also some direct vertical planting, depending on the local situation. And the winery here is Maibachfarm, a relatively young winery that was founded in 1998, and that is specializing, like everybody in the Ahr, in Pinot, in Spätburgunder. And so we have a wine that is coming from the blue slate that I mentioned. The deep underlying bedrock here in this particular case is limestone, but I don't think it's terribly relevant to the style of the wine. This is a wine much influenced by the schist. So the cru, the lager, is called Ahrweiler Rosenthal, and we have a wine that is aged in French oak. Low yield, of course, as always with Spätburgunder. I think if you are in your right mind, you don't want to crop Pinot at any more than 4 tons per hectare. Lucky you if you can get any more, of course. especially from poor rocky soils, and in this case, this vintage, it was actually even lower. When I taste our Pinot Noir, our Spätburgunder, they always have a very special style. I've been wondering for many years how to actually define it, what exactly is making a wine from the Ahr, especially now that I teach WSET and MW students in blind tasting, and they often ask me, how do I recognize a wine being from the Ahr from a wine being from the Pfalz? So it's not a very obvious question to answer. But I think it is a combination of cool and warm, okay? The microclimate in the Ahr is really quite cool, okay? It is quite north, it is in a side valley, it is a late spring, early autumn situation, short vegetative cycle compared to more southerly regions in Germany, but with the advantage of being fairly dry. As you know, the Mosel, for example, so the sister valley of the Ahr, is not a very rainy region. This is why you can also have a very long hang time on the Riesling, wait until November, because actually the autumns are fairly dry in the Mosel, okay? It is a sort of quite dry continental climate, and the same in the Ahr. So a lot of cooling influence, but the warm character is coming from the soil. So you have a soil that is getting, really warm in the sun, retains heat also in the evening, reverberates the sun rays together also with the river. So we have the similar effect to what we were talking about in the Hessische Bergstraße, where we had black granite. Here we have blue slate that is also giving you this effect of maximizing ripeness and heat and sun exposure on the vines. So look at the structure of this wine. It is a fully ripe Pinot, not really many vegetal notes. There's quite some spice, but otherwise, we've got cherries, we've got plum fruit. But the acidity is amazing in this wine. It is like a steel spine of this wine, is the acid, okay? The tannins are fine. The tannins, I think, are quite refined. If you taste the other two Pinots from Maibachfarm, the Ortswein, and they also have a regional blended wine, there the tannins I found a little bit more rustic, a little bit more, like stocky. I think this one has a nice sort of tannic polish to it. But I think the freshness of this wine and this core of acidity is what is making this wine quite special. So if you compare to other Spätburgunder origins in Germany, the more obvious origins like the Pfalz and the Baden, and maybe also Rheingau, Assmannshausen, no other region can have an acidity like this at this level of ripeness. Okay, you can have high acid in the Baden if you pick very early, but then you're never going to have this really ripe fruit. But here you can have an almost Riesling-like balance in the Spätburgunder, in the sense that you are waiting, you are delaying harvest, and you are achieving full physiological ripeness but keeping a very straight acidity. I think a very valid wine with a very strong sense of place, quite some spicy minerality. I quite like it. And now, Burggarten, the last wine, number 6, another estate from the Ahr, which is one of the newest members of the VDP. They were admitted in the VDP in 2019. The VDP now has 199 members in Germany. I wonder who is going to be the 200th. They should have a huge party when they admit a winery number 200. Maybe a well-known name. I don't know, Köhler Ruprecht. Maybe they go into the VDP. That would make for quite some headlines. So here is Paul Schäfer, the winemaker. He's thinking, God, how am I going to harvest my Pinot Noir this year? Which is always a challenge. And now look at this vineyard. I mean, this is completely amazing. This is Mosel or Saar levels of heroic viticulture. Okay, very, very small terraces, a lot of handwerk, completely unmechanizable. Now you can mechanize spraying because we have drones now for spraying, but yeah, they are not as precise maybe as someone going through the rows. And some completely amazing situations for growing Pinot Noir. Because if you think about the classic Pinot Noir growing regions such as Burgundy, but even, I don't know, Sonoma, you know, Yarra Valley, I love Yarra Pinot Noir, or Mornington Peninsula, but I mean, they don't look like this, okay? They have a much more easy situation to handle in terms of viticulture and vine management. And we are tasting now a really interesting Großes Gewächs from the Pinot that is coming from blue slate, Devonschiefer, but also something that is classified as a greywacke. You might have heard this name from New Zealand because this is where it is widespread in the Marlborough region. Even the winery is named after this. Really interesting to go and visit Burggarten on the table because they have an exception to the rule. They also have one Großes Gewächs that is coming from granite soils. So you could compare in two different glasses if you bring two glasses, a Pinot Noir from granite and a Pinot Noir from slate. This one is from slate, 50% new oak. They are not sparing any new oak, but Paul is believing that they have enough power and concentration in the Pinot due to the slate soil and this dry microclimate, extended hang time, that their wine can withstand a lot of new oak, and I think I agree. And if you go and see the other, you know, good wineries in the Ahr, such as Meyer-Nekel or Kreuzberg or Nelles, they are all using quite a lot of oak. And you don't really feel so much oak. I think the situation is quite similar to, you know, Côte de Nuit, where 30-50% new oak used to be quite standard, and often oak was not really, you know, an issue. Yeah, especially when it's really good oak. So I mean, the nose is really powerful. Yes, it is like a stone quarry. It is like standing in the middle of a stone quarry with stone being, you know, fractured and worked by machines. A little bit of fruit, but this one is not really about fruit like all great terroir wines. The fruit is somewhere there. It's a bit like oak, but really the wine is talking about the minerality and the terroir. And also a consequence of working in a great terroir, but of course you have to work very smartly, is the fantastic quality of tannins that you have here. I mean, they are so fine, so crystalline, so aligned. There is never really a moment of dryness in the wine. 50% new oak. Yeah, they're also giving tannins to the wine, but everything is really so very well blended and harmonized. So I think we have had a nice story of cool and coolish climate Pinot in this little overview of 6 wines. But you know, in all fairness, everybody is doing a good job in the Pinots that we tasted, from Czechia to many regions in Germany. But I think when we are in front of a great terroir and of a very special terroir for Pinot Noir, we feel it and we sense it and we acknowledge it. And the paradox here is that it is a volcanic soil that is never really associated with Pinot. Normally you expect a great variety like Riesling to be grown in this environment, or Assyrtiko maybe. If global warming continues, maybe the Ahr is going to have to plant some Assyrtiko in 20 or 30 years time. If you are planning your winery for like 3 or 4 generations, I would encourage everybody to plant Grenache and Assyrtiko, because before you notice, it's going to be very useful. But jokes aside, I think it's a fantastic expression of Pinot. Any questions? Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for coming today. And please thank and honor the winemakers by visiting them at their tables and tasting the wines. Thanks.